Okay, here we go. We're going to start getting into Murach's book on jQuery. So I know we're all excited about reading all 570 pages of this bedtime story, but by now you've already done the 11 pages. So let's do some math here. You've done the 11 pages of the appendix, plus looks like we're going to go up to page 48. 48 pages here. Going to equal 59 pages divided by 570 pages in the book puts us at 10%. So at the end of this lecture, plus the homework that you have to do for chapter 1, you will be 10% of the way through the book. If you haven't heard me say this already, this will be new. If you have, I apologize, but it's always a good reminder. If you take a look at the size of this thing, it's pretty big. It might say, wow, this is like an elephant. So I ask people, how do you eat an elephant? And what happens is most of the time people think about trying to eat this whole elephant. How do I eat this whole elephant? How am I going to read this whole book? How am I going to do all this homework? How am I going to get all of this done, plus my job, plus my other classes? How am I going to do all of this? How do you need an elephant? The answer is easy. One bite at a time. So what we're going to do is we're going to start and just take bite number 1. You've already done the appendix. You have already completed 11 pages out of 570. That's pretty good. You're on your way. So let's do another 48 pages and we'll be 10% of the way through the book. I did a quick overview, just kind of, I didn't really dig in super deep at this point. Did a quick overview of chapter 1, and what's really nice is it aligns very nicely with the PowerPoint slides. So depending on what works best for you, maybe um, looking at the PowerPoint slides on your machine locally, if you have a multiple screen setup, great, or printing out the PowerPoint slides and writing notes on the PowerPoint slides. I know PowerPoint, you can put like 6 or 4 slides on one page and then maybe write notes on them. That technique might work. Um, and I've decided for at least this chapter and maybe other chapters as well, I'm gonna just follow along with the PowerPoints and we'll review each page in the book. And mainly what I'm doing is kind of speed reading it, going over the high level points. I'm not going to read every single word. I'll point out the chapter, the phrases that I think are important, and I'll even tell you the stuff that, hey, wait a minute, this is new to me. I'm going to be honest here. I haven't spent a lot of time in this area and that area. I don't want to even begin to pretend that I am God's gift to JavaScript or jQuery or even web development, but hopefully I can be a good guide and we can learn and go through this together. Now, I have used JavaScript and jQuery for many, many years, but I don't do it every single day. My day job at Yale, I do a lot of other stuff in interface and integration work, but a lot of the principles and the same stuff applies. Chapter 1, if you haven't looked at it already, Chapter 1 is pretty much a high-level overview of the internet, but it points out some other key things related to this class as well. And it does talk about our friend Obtana as well. Okay, I'm on page 4. How a web application works. So, objectives: run a JavaScript application that are on the internet. And so, actually, in the files that you downloaded in your student, you can see I have actually instructor files, but in the student downloaded section, you have book apps, exercises, and solutions. In the book apps, chapter 1, email list. Now there's some files here that are actually going to be used in this chapter. So in the one of the techniques that the book has used and they've provided you with the information is in the book apps folder. Every single chapter has the supporting code with it that you can look at and glean from and borrow to get your job done. So we'll be referring to that um, as we go. If you have a Chrome browser installed, use its developer tools to find the statement that causes an error. Also, another good tool is in Firefox. If you install Firebug, I've used that as well. Use a text editor like IDE, like Aptina Studio 3 to edit HTML and JavaScript files. If you're using IDE like Aptana, it lets you run the applications from the IDE, and I think it will even do a good job of catching errors. So that'll be interesting to try that. I'm pretty sure Visual Studio and NetBeans does the same thing. Um, what are other objectives? You want components of a web app. We'll talk about the hypertext protocol. Distinguish between a web server process and static page and dynamic page. Describe the use of JavaScript and jQuery. Describe HTML and CSS. You should know that. Talk about div tags. Talk about attributes. Describe coding for CSS selectors, a little more CSS about the rule set. The components of a URL, you should know that. Describe the issue of cross-browser compatibility. What often happens is it might work in one browser and not the other. That used to be a big thing early in the early days of web, where it will work in Explorer but not work in Netscape or vice versa, and describe some workarounds for HTML5. And this normalized CSS piece right here, this normalized CSS is normalized CSS is a good thing to add to your web code to kind of it level sets your web page, and that's a good thing. Okay. Um, Page 5, the components of a web application. Now, what's interesting here is has you, actually page 4 and page 5, keywords like client, server, network, internet, LAN, WAN, ISP, internet service provider, that could be your Cox company, web browsers, web server, network, internet, the cloud. Those are all key terms that are discussed. In Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 are pretty heavy on the assignments that you need to fill out the definitions of these words. So a good thing to do would probably be to um, pull up that homework assignment page for Chapter 1 and have that open in Word. So maybe as you flip through this, you say, oh, the answers for that are here, here, and here. Most all of the words that are in italics in the book are words that are in the glossary, which are required as a part of your homework assignment. So the components of a web application, just looking at the picture, we see this picture of the cloud. The cloud is the internet. It's kind of this magical mystery thing that basically is pulling everything together. The cloud really is nothing more than the networking of computers and machines together. It's just computers that are somewhere else, because ultimately they're not in the cloud, they're not in the sky, they're in a building somewhere else. A web server like Bluehost is storing and holding your web pages and your various web components. And then your local computer is considered the client. A tablet would be considered the client. Your smartphone could be considered the client. These are all tools that are going to type something into the URL locator, and it's going to send a message, an HTTP request, out to the internet. It will get routed and it will end up at the web server. And at the web server, it will then say, oh, this is what you want, and then send it right back to you. And here are those terms that we just talked about. Um, a static web page. Most of you so far in Web 1 have created static web pages. It's a standard text page created in Notepad. There's nothing magical or mystical about it, but that is the document that is stored on the web server that then comes back to your browser, and the various tags like the B tag, the P tag, the H1 tag, those tags end up being the things that are clues to the browser to say, this is how I want you to look. Tie that in with a little bit of CSS, and this is how pretty I want you to make it. And so there's a picture of the standard static web page process. A request is made from the client, which is your computer or your cell phone or your tablet, and then that it locates the web server and then sends the information of a friend of mine, Professor Fred Stefanowicz, years ago used to talk about a little delivery truck. And what you would do is you'd send a delivery truck from your computer out to the web server. The um, the web server would then load up the web page into the back of the delivery truck and then send it back to your computer. And then your browser would see the hypertext markup language, all the HTML tags, and then it would interpret it and know how to display it. And that's called rendering a page. Now, a dynamic web page, and we're flipping on now to pages 8 and 9. A dynamic web page is more than just a standard web page. Now think about it right here. Here's Amazon.com, and there's a lot of stuff going on here. Think about how many millions of items Amazon.com has. So do you think somebody has manually created a web page for every single item that's being sold? That would be impossible. But rather, a framework is created to display the page, and then based upon data stored in a database, like for instance, the under under books, there's an item for the Murach book, and the Murach book then has got all the information stored in a database that then you can say, what's the ID for that item? Go get it, and then render the page all within the framework of a single page. And we do that in the Fundamentals of Internet Programming class. It's really great that you learn that concept. But this is a dynamic web page where the structure and the page itself is designed kind of from a static point of view of how do I want you to look, but the content that is getting put into the page is dynamically fed from databases and other things. So here's the flow of how that works. The web browser, remember before we just had the web browser sending a request to the web server, the HTTP request, and then the HTTP response with the HTML would come back. Well, now in a dynamic page, before that HTTP response comes back to your browser, the web server says, oh, I know you want to do something. Application code then does some stuff, even will seek out to the database, find the information. The database server then brings it back to the application server. The application server actually then builds the HTML dynamically based upon the code that was written and then sends it through the web server back to your web browser. That's called a round trip, where it goes all the way through. And then what could happen is you could pull up another item and it is actually displaying the same look and feel page, but with other information based upon that information which you sent to it, saying, I want to look at this product or this product. I want to see it in blue or something like that. Now here, this page here on page 11 is talking about image swaps. Now, an image swap, what actually happened here is that the page was probably generated and rendered from the database through, and then the information comes back. Now it's living in the browser, and information is already stored in the browser, and both the blue version of the sweater and the orange version of the sweater are already stored locally, and JavaScript and jQuery working together says click on this, click on that, and what will happen is that work happens right within the browser, because already in the trip of pulling the information out, the other stuff is needed. The two versions, the three versions of that graphic is already there. And that's called client-side rendering, client-side processing versus server-side processing. In here, dynamic web pages that are created from a database server can be dynamic and processed on the web server, the server side, but then also things get processed locally on the client side. And that's where JavaScript fits into this, is that in that return trip of that HTTP response, it's not only just HTML code or the HTML tags that are coming back to your browser, but also what happens is a bunch of JavaScript code, and the JavaScript objects are coming back as well, or the jQuery. Now, JavaScript engine already lives inherently in your browser. So do take a look, and I would definitely say page 8, really read that closely and understand those keywords. Those words are in the dictionary definition. Definitely go through and understand page 9 and understand page 10. We've talked about that at kind of a high level on page 11. Now, flipping through, now what happens is here's a sample of the email application. Now, what I wish they had in the book, and I think what they do is, I think if I go to if we take a look at the book information here, email list, HTML. Okay, we're seeing the full rendering. If you notice here, this display here of the application is not this display that's being shown in the PowerPoint slide, because it does not have the CSS already put in it. This is just the pure HTML code displaying the work. And you've already done this where you've done HTML and then you've added CSS to the code. Now page 14. So there we see the code that actually created the page. Page 14, then we would add things like the CSS code to it. And so now here we have the HTML for the form and the buttons for the form. And now that CSS is applied to it, we can now see that that's a lot prettier version. And here it is in the Book Apps Chapter 1 email list piece. And then if I type in some code, and I type in some other code, and I type in some other code, and I click Join Our List, it says this entry must equal the first entry. Now that work that is happening right there is because of the JavaScript code that was added to the page. That work that is comparing the first email address to the second email address. That's because of JavaScript. That's not because of HTML. So if I go Paul and I'll go lowercase, I'm curious what will happen. Paul, and click Join Our List. It still doesn't like that. If I go Paul, join our list. Thank you for joining our list. Now, what's interesting here that it didn't do was good solid email validation. Typically, a good solid email validation would take this and at least look for the @ sign, and maybe look for a domain name .com, .net, or .something, and like an @ sign and a period to determine that it's a real email list. But that work that just happened, that did this, is all happening because of the JavaScript. Now, if I right-click View Page Source, what I see here is I see a reference to the CSS file that's showing it pretty, and then I see a reference to the JS file. So now, going back to our Book Apps Chapter 1 email list, if I right-click and edit with Notepad, now here is all of the JavaScript code that is getting implemented when the page runs. And looking at the JavaScript code, notice here that we have a button that says join list, and then we have an email form here, this JavaScript code, looking here. So the join list function right here starts the ball to working. And basically this function here will run based upon that button being pushed. So upon the button being pushed, and it looks like that's right here on click. On the on click event, so when the page loads up, when the window loads up, it's loading up an event, waiting for an event, and that event for the join on the click on the join list button will actually then kick and invoke and make this code run. And so what happens is this ID here for the button says when somebody clicks that button, because this code was already happened on the load of the JavaScript, this then says, I want you to do this. And that function is, in fact, this function right here. Okay, let's move on, see how we're doing. So there's the CSS code. Pretty straightforward stuff. That's page 15. And that's making the body the right font and the H1 the right color. And it looks like we're getting a blue box around it, which is nice. A little more CSS added, and that's in the email list.css file, which, let's see, where is my, so again, in the book apps, this email CSS file right there. See if I expand that out, there you can see it. There's the JS file and the code, the HTML code, and then the join code is basically saying thank you for joining the list. Now, nothing has really happened at this point. It just really kind of lied to us because other work would have to happen. This is where PHP or some database-related JavaScript would actually go out, take that email address, and then add it to a table somewhere, add it to a file that could then actually say, now you're really on the mailing list. Let's go to page, that gets you through page 14 and page 15. So read through those pages. There's the code for the email list JavaScript. Continued, continued. One of the things that this book will rely on is HTML semantic elements, header, main, section, article, aside, nav, figure, and footer. That is the current, those are the key main tags that are used in CSS. And what will happen is that the JavaScript and jQuery code that we will be writing and using and learning about, these are considered components, elements of the DOM. And the DOM is the document object model. When a web page is created, that web page is the document. And the object model, all the components thereof are the pieces of that. And if you go to page 16, the second paragraph, and I'm going to read that directly. When JavaScript changes the HTML for a page, it is called DOM scripting. Okay, DOM scripting, remember that. That's because the JavaScript is actually changing the document object model, or DOM. It's generated by the browser when the page is loaded. This DOM represents all of the elements and attributes that are coded in HTML. Then, when JavaScript changes any aspect of the DOM, the change is immediately made in the browser display as well. So what's interesting is that when a page is rendered through your browser, all of the objects and elements of that page are also in memory and of the browser. And in JavaScript, you get to control and manipulate those elements. If you can reference it and if it has a property, you can change it. And then at that point, your JavaScript code can dynamically change the page on the client without going back to the web server. And then keep reading the rest of this, and it talks about the various elements that are being used. To start, this code consists of three functions: a $sign function, a join list function that is executed when the user clicks on the button, and a function that is run after the DOM has been loaded into the browser. Then in the join list function, you see four if statements. When the clauses that provide most of the logic for this application. So those if statements are doing the work of comparing the information on those two email boxes there. What's different about JavaScript, here you can see that the if-else structure is similar to those of any modern programming languages like Java, C# or PHP or Python. I know I have a bunch of my Python students in this class. You can also see that declaring a variable var and assigning a value to it is done in a way that's similar to a way that's done in other programming languages like C, and Java. However, in Python, we learned we don't actually have to declare variables. So those of you who are just Python folks, you're going to be doing variable declaration in JavaScript and jQuery. What's different about JavaScript is that it provides methods and properties that let you modify the DOM. Excuse me. For instance, the $sign function uses the getElementById method to get the object with the ID that passes to the function. Then the first statement in the join list function uses the dollar function to get the object that represents the first textbook in the HTML. This statement also uses the value property to get the value that is used to enter in the text box. So what's happening is we now have direct access to any element that's on the page. And then within the code, we then actually get to modify information. So there's the HTML. There's some HTML elements that it's talked about, the semantic elements: body, header, main, footer. Here's the HTML in a browser. Div tags, the book refers to, so now in page 18, it's talking about those HTML5 semantic elements: main, section, aside, nav. And then it moves on into page 20, where it talks about the div and the span tags, that they don't get used as much. Quite honestly, they haven't been forgotten. They're used all the time. But as HTML and web development is progressing, they're used less. The div and the span, the key thing is that to actually talk to or change a div tag, it does have to have an ID. And here you'd say div ID equals and some name. Span and span equals and some name. Here's a spam ID equals email address 1 error. And so at that point, you then by the fact that you are within a page in the document and you have a span tag called email address one error, that becomes a part of the DOM, and that says, well, then you could change it. You can make it say whatever ever you want it to say. Page 2021 goes over that. Page 22 and 23 talk more about the details of the ID and name referencing of CSS objects. More of that. And see, you can see now um, the H2 tag is then you're assigning a class to it, so you can have different classes to then display the H2 tag differently, and that class would be defined in your CSS. And you can see references here under the form tag that the ID and name are actually identical. That's actually a good practice, is that for the name and the ID to be the same, and that way you're sure that you'll reference the right thing at the right place correctly. HTML in a web browser with a tooltip displayed, and let's see what they're talking about there. I don't see a reference to that we can actually see that work. So I don't know where that piece of code is. But a tooltip usually happens when you mouse over something and then you can see something appear on that. Um, Two ways, there's actually three ways of rendering and modifying how things look in a web page through CSS. External style sheet, embedded in the page, and inline in the tag itself. You really want to use inline in the tag itself. It's very difficult to maintain that. Embedded in the page only on special examples, but the best way is to use an external CSS file for the page. Also, if you have um, a lot of complex CSS, breaking it down into multiple pages is easier to maintain. And remember that CSS is always loaded from the top down. So if you set a certain element in for your page to look like this way, but then down later you reset it to something else, it will take the last version of that as the page loads. So embedded and external. So here's an example of two style sheets, main.css and speaker.css. And with that, anything in the speaker CSS will override anything that was set in the main CSS. HTML can be selected by type, ID, or class. So here's some examples. If you take a look at the P tag, the P tag class is set to blue. And so in the CSS, if there is probably a P class called blue, also, P can be, there's an ID P tag for copyright. So in the CSS, there's probably a reference to the ID to the P tag with an ID for P. And if there was a P tag with nothing, no class or no ID, then it would be referenced to that all by itself. And matter of fact, here's some examples of the P tag all by itself with a copyright, the ID selector called copyright, and then the class is called blue and right. So where you can see ID equals copyright down towards the bottom, it's going to reference that pound copyright look and feel. Where it says class equals blue, you can see where class selectors is going to be the color blue. So then if you went p dot blue, then it will reference the p with the class blue. It will reference that. So now here you can see how the h tag and the p tags and that copyright tag are all being in blue because the class was added to that in the call. So that gets us through through to page 30, how to run a JavaScript application. Well, here we go. Because it's all already loaded up in this one page, if we click on index.html in our um, so I'm in the student download book apps chapter 1 email, this HTML page, the application is there sitting there waiting to run. If I click join our list, these fields are required. The JavaScript application just ran because everything was loaded into memory. The needed code, as we've already talked about, the CSS file is there for the displaying. The JavaScript file is there, and here's, let's see if I can make it look a little prettier. There, the JavaScript file is there and it's loaded in. The index page is here, and the join page, which is the end result. The index page is the driver of the document, and then the application actually runs when the page is loaded. Now we try to do something. We click on the join list button, and it says, "Hey, you've got some information missing." I'm going to put SSS, SSSW, and then SSS, join list. Oh, this must be equal to the first one. So now the if statements within that JavaScript function are doing the compare. It doesn't like it. Says something's different. Get rid of that. Hit that. It passed the test, and then now it's displaying the last page. On page 31 in the book, it talks about the HTTP URL and the components thereof right here. And basically, it's broken off into 4 places. The protocol, and that is how is the data getting sent? What is the configuration of the packets, of the bits and bytes that are being sent from the server, from the client to the server and back? HTTP is one protocol. FTP, that's another protocol. HTTPS is another protocol. www.modulemedia.com is the domain name, just like you have www.yourwebsite.com. That is the domain name. And what's actually behind the domain name is an IP address. I used to refer to it as a telephone number. And then the path is the folders in which certain files, and then ultimately you have a file name. Now, by default, if you don't type in HTTP, it will happen automatically. Now, what's interesting is some web servers are expecting HTTPS for secure, so you may or may not have to type that depending on the server. If you omit a file name under a path, it's always going to assume some form of index, and it'll either be used index HTML, index HTM, index PHP, index CFM, and a few others, and or default HTM, as the book says. That if a person says www.mydomainname.com/CST250, if you don't put an index page in there, it's just going to look for some form of an index page. Have not played with Chrome Developer Tool that much, or actually at all. So that will be something that'll be interesting to play with. It looks like F12 when you run Chrome, and or Control Shift I, and that's page 32 and 33. I'm sure we'll have plenty of opportunities for debugging. And then so a little more work on Chrome's Developer Tool. And like I said, also take a look at for Firefox, install the Firebug plugin for Firefox, and that's a pretty cool tool that I've used a bunch of times over the years. Um, so if you have an error in JavaScript, open the console panel by clicking the console tab, and you should see the error message along with the line of code that caused the error message. And that usually gives you a hint where to look, what you have to type. Did you miss a semicolon? Click on the link to the right of the error message, and that indicates the line of code. That will open the sources panel with the portion of JavaScript code that contains the statement it displays in the statement highlighted. And so are we in Aptina at this point? And I think we might, I don't know if we are here or not. Elements Network Solutions. Boom. Okay, HTML5 ratings of current browsers. It looks like Chrome is winning currently. That Chrome probably does the best job with HTML5, i.e., no surprise, does the worst. And Opera is actually a nice little browser. I've used it a few times, and I actually have it on my cell phone. And it actually works very quick. It's a very lightweight browser, does it? And if you go to that website, html5test.com, you can see these ratings and more information. I think you can even have your website tested and rated for HTML5 quality. Sometimes old browsers won't work, and part of me says, don't worry about it. We only care about people that use new browsers. And then at that point but there are people that maybe are going to buy our products, or our grandmother that we want to see our website and she's still on Internet Explorer 7 or something. By adding the JavaScript shiv code, which is the easiest way to do that is this link that's right here. By adding that up top in your headset, you say it forces old browsers to understand and recognize. It basically interprets the new tags into old tag speak, so those browsers will work. Another thing to do is to download the normalize.css file and put that into your CSS folder. Highly recommend it. And that typically you have JavaScript, you might have your CSS code and then your JavaScript code. The first CSS file you should always have is the normalized CSS file. And that way, what that does is it level sets your browser, and it says, I now know what to expect now, and nothing's in memory, nothing's going to mess me up. It's kind of it sets margins, it sets a few other things as a default for certain things, that it's kind of a level set playing field. And then from there, add your style sheets and things like that. We've talked about cross-browser compatibility, JavaScript Shiv, JavaScript Sim, and normalized CSS. Aptina project, I'm so frustrated with this product right now. I'll dig on this in my own, but notice basically it's saying open up a project in Book Apps, and you can open those projects up, creating a new project where your code is going to live. Um, I'm gonna punt on this one, quite honestly, and go through this. And if it works for you, great. If it doesn't, don't kill yourself with it. And let's just use Text Wrangler like you did in Text Wrangler Notepad++. The more I was looking at the chapters in the book, the less I think Aptina Studio is going to do a whole lot for us. It's your call 100%. More stuff on Aptina. And it does show you how to run an application within Aptina. And my guess is it might be kind of nice and show you some errors and stuff that you can find elsewhere. Probably the hardest part in JavaScript coding is coming up with a methodology that works for you for controlling and handling your errors. So chapter 1 is really a high-level introduction. I've pointed out a couple of the key places to, when you're reading through the chapter, to look at. We've gone through this in 45 minutes. I would suggest now going back at the beginning of chapter 1 with a red pen and a marker and just kind of, peruse through it and point out those important things that stand out as being needed. Again, this is chapter 1 in any textbook is probably always the easiest one. It's setting some groundwork for you. The exercises, you can really walk through those nicely, and that's the key. And while you're going through chapter 1, this is the best time now to pull up the homework assignment document and do the glossary terms, because you've got a lot of terms that you have to put in definitions for. And this will now, we've talked about it again, high level. My goal is to not, um, some of the learning is on you to actually read the chapter, but to point out the high level places that I think are important or need extra work or extra explanation. Hope this has helped, and let's uh, let's get exercise 1 done and complete, and then move on to exercise to chapter 2. Great.